But in 1900, the predominant theory of cancer was that it was parasites. Big names in academic medicine, that was the prominent belief. One of those big names is Dr. William Russell. He was a pathologist that we studied in medical school in the 70s. He saw what he called the characteristic organism of cancer. And he described parasites, right? He said every cancer patient has this organism. It eats the cell from the inside out. By 1976, we studied William Russell, but we didn't get the right term because somebody had changed it in the textbooks over time. It no longer said the characteristic organism, which would have implied an infection. It said, oh, Dr. Russell saw these black things in cells of cancer patients. We call them Russell bodies.
Welcome to today's episode of the Alix Mayer Show. Today's guest is Dr. Lee Merritt, and she's coming out with a new book called Escaping the Medical Matrix. And when you listen to this interview, you are going to feel like you are escaping the medical matrix. I recommend getting a notebook and taking notes for this one. We started out talking about hantavirus because that's in the news, but we went to parasites and cancer. And all I can say is this conversation is going to change your life. Tune in and enjoy. The Alix Mayer Show is sponsored by Mish International, gold and silver specialists since 1963. When you need protection from monetary inflation and leveraged assets exposure, you contact the dedicated people at Mish International. Mish International, a family business, offers true expertise, integrity, reliability, and fair pricing of gold and silver. Visit their website at mishinternational.com. That's MISH international.com. Dr. Lee Merritt, it is my great pleasure to have you on the Alix Mayer Show today. I had the pleasure of meeting you recently at a function in Baltimore held by my friend Middleton and just had the best time talking to you. You are a researcher beyond all researchers, and I give you the research crown. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed us standing there eating oysters together at the
I know.
bar. That was pretty fun.
That was a real treat. Yeah, and people who understand the benefits of oysters were like hovering around the raw oyster bar. Very, very generous of our friend Middleton. So today, hantavirus is in the news, and so is Ebola. And so I thought, Lee, that we would start right there with hantavirus. Have you done a little research on that?
Yeah, I just put out, in fact, people said, you should really put out a video about hantavirus. So I did a little Rumble thing. I'm in a t-shirt that, I came in from the garden and I just threw this thing together. And the title of it is, do I really need to explain the hantavirus scam? Because it's the same play. It's the COVID play, wash, rinse, and repeat with just a different little variant here. But right. Hantavirus is interesting because this isn't a new thing. This isn't like COVID. They claimed it was brand new. We've never seen it before. Hantavirus has been around for a long time, and that's what makes it kind of fun because you can see how the story has changed. Hantavirus and again, I'm not saying it because I believe there are viruses. I'm just going to make this disclaimer. I really don't believe they're little mythical flying unicorns. And it's not about belief, by the way. It's not about proof. That's mathematics. It's about the preponderance of evidence. But when I spent 2 years of my life after I heard some other people, talking about it, about this whole virus controversy. And I spent 2 years deciding whether or not what side of this thing I was on and what's really going on here, because that's a huge thing. But it turned out I didn't have to go very far back. We have 4 generations of medical texts in my house, and I didn't have to go back beyond my own texts to find out when the scam started about viruses, because people don't realize how much the world has changed since I was in medical school in the 70s. And what they're telling us now is not what they were telling us then. So that gets us to hantavirus. Hantavirus, we knew it as, I think that I first heard about it when I was a resident in orthopedics. And so it was in the 80s sometime. But what it was about was, it was a little outbreak of maybe 15, 20 people. It wasn't usually a huge number, but it was interesting because it was associated with like mouse droppings. It was always in areas of poverty, usually there was 2 of the places we know, Indian reservations and the like slums in the big city somewhere, these housing project slums in those days. And it had to do, they associated it with with rats and mice around, and they kind of decided it was something in the urine of the rats and mice that was doing this. The only other big one that I knew about, the other episode, was when, after the Nunn-Lugar Act was passed in 1991, which that was supposed to be the Defense Threat Reduction. And I always say, when you hear threat reduction, run away, because that's not what that's about. But in any
It's the
case,
opposite,
we got
right?
it was passed in the middle of the night, 1991. They spent $400 million a year for 4 years to buy up all the bioweapons labs and the chemical weapons stores and things of the old Soviet Union in those socialist republics. Okay, so we're not just talking about bioweapons labs in Ukraine. It was Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Tbilisi, Georgia. So this is called the Nunn-Lugar Act after Senators Nunn and Lugar. They weren't hiding this. In Tbilisi, Georgia, they had the Lugar lab. And I have pictures of him standing in front of this big sign, the Lugar lab.
Really? What an odd thing. Why would we buy up bioweapons labs in Eastern Bloc countries?
Well, what do you do with bioweapons? Oh, you go after your purported enemy, per se. But in any case, it's offshore. We've already signed the bioweapons treaty. We can't be doing this, so we have to do it offshore. And what's interesting is, and so the argument was that the old Soviet Union was collapsing and these socialist republics were destitute for cash, and we didn't want them selling all this stuff like nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons stores to bad people, right?
Oh, so we took one for the team.
So we're going to help you. But if you look at what they did, I mean, this is a little off hantavirus, but it's how we got there. We sent our people over. So we bought for $400 million a year for 4 years. We bought these labs. It's kind of like the Mexican lease. We didn't buy the land. We just bought the rights to the lab. And then we sent our people over there to say, to get the labs up to modern standards, to do vaccine research and to do gain of function research. Okay. Now, when you hear your congressman, bloviate about how, oh, we didn't know about those labs in the Ukraine and what other, no, of course they did, because you know what? They were giving these people their W-2 or their, W-2 forms every year. They were paying them. So somebody knew. I mean, they testified years ago, they testified about this in Congress. But here's where it gets to haunt it. In 2017, Putin went public and he said, hey, every time you guys, meaning us, stand up these labs in these old socialist republics, all these weird diseases show up. Now, and specifically, at one point, the Russians had to put down what we call a cordon sanitaire, meaning they shut their borders to any kind of disease coming through because all these bad things were happening. And one of them was hantavirus, and one of them was Crimean hemorrhagic fever. So it's interesting that now you're talking about hantavirus and Ebola. So Ebola is also a hemorrhagic fever. But these were things that he reported having come out of these labs. And there were other things. There was an outbreak of typhoid. There's lots of things. And quite frankly, these are typhoid is a classic bioweapons agent, by the way. So I'm not, could it be natural? Sure, I suppose it could be, but it's just kind of interesting that we set up the labs and coincidentally all these things start happening. The same thing happened before the pandemic of 19 in Kansas, by the way. We set up a medical school, an outbreak of typhoid came out, we brought down vaccines, then a huge meningitis outbreak went, we brought down more vaccines, and then we got the pandemic of 1918 started. So
wow,
it's like this has happened before.
And it's like Lab 257 on Plum Island, right? And not only Lyme disease, but there were two other infections that came out of that.
Absolutely. So there have been research about this. So don't think because we signed a bioweapons treaty in 1972, I think we wrote it in 71, signed it 72 or 73, that we actually quit that, and anybody quit that. I'm not saying it's just us, but in any case, this has been happening. So hantavirus, we knew it about in the slums, Indian reservations, and out of Ukraine, out of the Ukrainian labs. So, and it was always just a few people, and it was related to mice and rats. So now fast forward to 2026, and it's just a chuckle every minute, because here you have a cruise ship, and I can't remember, was this a Princess or this was a Norwegian?
I don't know either.
I can't remember either, but I remember thinking it's a nice cruise line. I mean, this is not some sleazy, dirty cruise line. I mean, I've taken lots of cruises. I've taken tours of the ships. These are beautiful modern ships. This is not the old British Navy where you had cats on there to control the rats. There's not mouse droppings in the gym floor on a Norwegian cruise line or whatever this cruise line was. So suddenly we went from having mice infestation causing this to now we have this virus that's out in a fancy cruise ship. And oh, by the way, how did they make the diagnosis? Because you see, the diagnosis was always made clinically. When you got a bunch of people on an Indian reservation and they just suddenly all start getting sick and similar symptoms, and this is one of the issues in certain situations, you start looking at this disease, right? That's the way kind of medicine works. It's not precise.
Right.
But here we have a beautiful cruise ship. And interestingly, too, when they ship these guys, now I live near Offutt Air Force Base, Omaha, Nebraska. When they shipped these people off that cruise ship to go to the University of Nebraska biocontainment unit, there were 13 of them, and I understand, that went through Offutt, but only one was symptomatic. Okay, so then we have the question is, why are you testing asymptomatic people on a cruise ship? What are you testing them with? And then we get back to what we saw in COVID, where for the first time in medical history since time immemorial, a case of a disease was made on the basis of a lab test. We never called it a case of smallpox because of some test. We said it's smallpox because it has this, 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 this. It looks like this. This is what we see. And clinically, we make the diagnosis. A case of typhoid, a case of malaria, right? It's not because of a test. But certainly in the age of COVID, a PCR test is all you need to declare that that's a case of, even if the person's not sick. And then the next question is, how did they happen to have PCR tests for hantavirus on a cruise ship that's never had an outbreak of hantavirus before?
That's exactly right.
And how many people did they test if most people that got off the ship were asymptomatic? Did they test the whole ship?
Well, and by the way, PCR testing is contraindicated in somebody without symptoms because it doesn't mean anything.
Well, beyond that, PCR test is never indicated. If anybody's interested, don't believe me, read the inventor's book. It's a wonderfully written book. He's really a great author. Kerry Mullis, he wrote in his book, Dancing Naked in the Minefield. I love that title.
I do too. I have it.
Oh, yeah. Well, then, so he wrote, but, it's very clear why you can't use these. Now, I did my own research, though. About August of 2020, I started saying, this whole thing is not, I mean, I knew it wasn't right before that. I thought it was a bioweapon early on. But when we got to August, I said, these stupid PCR tests, we've never made a diagnosis of a disease solely on the basis of a test. They're telling us that if we get tested with this, it has to be the SARS-CoV-2 unique virus. It has to be this because we've never seen it before. And there were 3 places. There was the Louis Pasteur Institute in France. There was the Drosten Group in Germany and the CDC in America. And they all created 6 tests that they claim came from a very, very specific and unique, totally unique area of this virus that has never been seen before. Okay, but by this time, and even though I'm just a dumb orthopedic surgeon, I can read and study things. And so by this time, I've studied about how testing works.
Right. Well, back up a second, because the sequence that they used was from those researchers in Wuhan, China, who got a sample from the tissue of one guy who had a cough in Wuhan, which could have been from pollution.
Yeah, that's true.
And then they threw away the sample so nobody could peer review it. And then they're going and making PCR tests off of that.
I agree with that, but the testing. It's not just about this one virus. See, they're starting to do PCR testing for everything, and so in principle, they claim they pick a unique sequence that's only in that thing, and if it comes to you. Now, the problem is you and I and everybody, including all sorts of living things, we share about 65% of our genome with every living thing. Mm-hmm. So. I jokingly say 65% of us we share with a banana, maybe 70% if you're a politician. Oh, the problem is that it's one thing to say you have a sequence. It's another thing to say you are the only thing in the world that has that sequence. And that's what they were saying about COVID. So there's an area of the NIH, a computer file there. It's called the gene bank. And if you find some if you find some if you genetically sequence some new species of insect or whatever you find out and you're doing your research for biology and you think this is a totally unique animal, you sequence its genome, you can compare it to other genomes in the NIH gene bank. And
Right.
the way you do this, not to get too technical, but this is really a big deal. It's called the BLAST program. So you take
Yep.
the BLAST program, it has empty boxes. You can take these sequences and find out where they're from. Now, I took those 18 sequences from the PCR tests of COVID that were supposed to be only SARS-CoV-2, the virus of COVID. I put them in the BLAST program, and guess what they came up? They did
What?
not come up SARS-CoV-2. They came up Homo sapiens gene 5, Homo sapiens gene 12, Homo sapiens gene 8. They were testing us to our own human genome.
Right. So if you tested positive on a PCR test for SARS-CoV-2, it just meant you're human.
Right. So now they've, since I started speaking about this, by the way, interestingly, see, it used to be that's all you did. When you put the sequence in, you pressed a button and you got the answer. And then if you wanted to know more, you could then look at different, specifically by species. And
Mhm.
yes, so if you do that, now you will find that the first one that comes up is SARS-CoV-2. But if you then take that out and you say, well, use the same sequence, you just found SARS-CoV-2 and sequence it for Homo sapiens, that's us, it'll also find us. And I did it for bird flu, swine flu. The current bird flu, I cannot find the sequences they're using, which means they're hiding them. You can't have a test and not tell us how you're doing the test.
Exactly.
And Kerry Mullis makes that point elegantly in his book. He said, if you're going to tell me that I have to do some horrible treatment because of something, I want to know, make my own decision, how you came up with the qualification to say that. What was the test you did? How did you do it? Let me see the data. If you're not willing to see the data, I don't believe you. And I think that's where we are. Same thing with hantavirus.
Well, but also, I mean, you have to look behind the test and how the test was developed. And, how do you validate a test if you don't have an original sample of what you think it is?
Right. So then that gets to the next point, and this is what got me in trouble, by the way, in 2020. In fact, it really didn't get me in trouble. My kids, I had a lawyer that wanted me to take NPR to court, but my kids, I said to them, my only damage is that my sons kind of treat me with more respect now. They got a hit piece on NPR all to myself, but this is what it was over. So I'm a former military surgeon, and I was watching what was happening to the military. And quite frankly, since the pandemic of 1918, we have just been vaccinating our military to death. I mean, literally to death. There is, and if you go back in time, back to World War II, back to even before that, you will see the actual military documents from the hospital admissions of people for vaccine side effects and generals screaming that we have to stop this vaccination. We're losing more people in the Philippines to the vaccination than we are to the war, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of understanding that this was not, at that time, in the past, when you could honestly publish things, the people were complaining about this. So they knew that they were being targeted, I think, and being. So when I was speaking at an American Frontline Doctors meeting, and I just made this. This is before they really pushed the mandate on the military. But I had already looked at this thing about the PCR test, and I'd read the article that you're referencing from the Wuhan bat lady, Zhengli Shi, I think. And I just made this simple comment. I said, you know, we're about to vaccinate all of our military, the border patrol, your police, your fire, your trauma surgeons, your truck drivers, everybody that supports the security infrastructure of America. You're about to vaccinate them with a vaccine whose blueprint we got from the People's Liberation Army, the Communist Chinese Army. I don't think, last I looked, these were our allies. What are you thinking? What's going on here? And
It's a
later,
reasonable question.
I mean, it's really a simple question. Does
Yeah.
anybody see this nightmare? This is a national security potential nightmare. Now, I couldn't prove it has turned out to be, but I couldn't prove it was going to be, but I could suggest that it would be. And this is caution you should any sane thinking military individual should take, and any sane person and doctor. Well, yeah, so I got in big trouble for saying that, but later, that paper that you're talking about, the paper from the bat lady of the Wuhan lab. It's interesting that in science, I grew up in the age of paper, so I didn't have computer uh, access when you were reading professional papers in medicine science. You read them on paper, and so if you saw all these people like listed, you would have to go down to the footnotes and you'd have to find out where they were from, and you'd have to then very laboriously go and see if you could find any information to contact them if you want to contact them. But not so now. The nice thing about the computer, if I want to find out where somebody is that's an author of a paper, all I have to do is wander over it and it tells you where he's from and how to contact him. So I did that. After 9 months or 10 months of this paper being out from China, I had it on my desk printed out in paper. So I didn't think to do this. But then one day I decided to say, hey, wait a minute. Who are the actual authors? Not just the general. I knew they were all Chinese, but who are the actual authors? And I started at the top. There were 29 of these authors. And it would say, so and so is from the Shanghai Institute of Biology or whatever. And I would go and then I'd look at because you can translate to English or it would be in English and you could find, but that guy wasn't there. Okay, well, that happens in science. People move around, graduate students say, okay, go to the next guy. But 28 of them were not there.
Seriously?
28 of the 29. And then I got to the last person. That was the bat lady of the Wuhan lab, and she was there. She was the one person I could verify. Now, I'm not, somebody can make me a liar here and say, oh, I looked it up and I found that person. Okay, I'll give it to you. I mean, at some point, this gets pretty tedious. But I'm going to tell you, at least in my hands, I couldn't find 28 of them. And that's not right. You should be able to find somebody where they say they are.
Right. So you go to the university website and they're supposed to be a professor or a researcher. They're not listed.
Again, you're dealing with Chinese names, but it's all translated. At some point, just on random chance alone, some of these guys ought to show up. The only one I could prove was a living person was Zheng Li Shi. And I will tell you, I've seen this before. When COVID came out, I gave a talk at Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. This is the funniest, some funny things happen here. And I was showing this, I had accidentally, just a couple days before, discovered that one of these papers, which you knew was nonsense about mask wearing, disease like the flu every year. When we see a disease like the flu, it's a bell-shaped curve. It goes through a period where everybody seems to be coming down with it. There's all the diseases happening. Then it kind of peaks out, and then it goes back down. It's a bell-shaped curve. Well, COVID was a bell-shaped curve. In fact, if you superimpose the death count of COVID over the death count of COVID in Sweden, where they didn't mask, they didn't social distance, and they didn't shut down the schools, they didn't do anything, it was the same bell-shaped curve. So this was okay.
So case control right there for lockdowns.
Right. But there was a paper that came out and it had 4 authors on it. And it had this bell-shaped curve. And then it had these lines drawn like, well, clearly social distancing didn't work because here was the line of the social distancing, it's still going up. And then when it comes to the top of the curve, it says, well, isolation works somewhat. But when we put on the masks and then they show this down curve, it really did something. Now, it's nonsense. Like I say, it's a superimposable curve on somebody that did none of that. But then I went back and looked at the authors and the same thing. So none of these people, none of them are from New York City. This was a study done on masking in New York City, epidemiology study, right? None of them are epidemiologists. One of the guys, for example, they were like engineers and weird. One of the guys was he was some kind of like a mineral engineer or something at Caltech. What the heck is he doing writing something like this? And then the last guy he had been in some other, he was so the last author is often the senior author. And this person was some guy he was in a different sphere, but I gave him the credit. I mean, he might have been real. But these three engineers, a couple in Texas, one at Caltech. So I literally emailed the guy at Caltech. I said, "Do you know that your name's on this paper? I'm just curious. I'm just reading the paper, and I'm not putting the connection between you and mask research and epidemiology, you know."
And
And I never got an answer back. But this is funny. When I gave the talk, okay, it turns out the fourth author was known for being involved in global warming. And I'm giving this talk to Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. So one of my friends there is Willie Soon. Dr. Soon was an independent scientist, PhD at Harvard. And he's the guy that they love to hate about climate change because he's been showing the real science for decades that this is nonsense, that you're not having, the oceans aren't rising. This is how, and he shows how that's been done. You can't measure the global temperature that easily on the surface. He goes through the whole science. So they hate him. But when I'm giving this talk, and this guy had something to do, Dr. Soon's in the audience, and he jumps up and he says, "Wait a minute, I know that guy. He's a complete fraud." And he starts off. So it was
no way.
So you get fact checked in the middle of your speech.
Right. But it
That's awesome.
Points out how this whole, we are living, that's why my new book's Escaping the Medical Matrix. We are living in a false reality. And what you're seeing, I've been trying to tell people, it's worth understanding how they've pulled this off. And that's what I've been doing. I've been going back and looking at false scientists and false science. It's really kind of fun and kind of funny. It's what you find out about this. And you realize they've created this worldview, and that the problem is that when current research by really well-meaning people, most people are not evil that are involved in this research. They're not stupid. They have a worldview. So if your worldview is that we get sick because we transfer, invisible little beings called viruses back and forth from each other, then that's how you're going to start out. But if that premise is false, if there are no such things, then you're starting from a false assumption, and you just completely add to that, and it just gets more convoluted. And it's one thing after another. I mean, that's and it's hard for the average person. There is one benefit, not much in these days, I think, of having an MD degree, but one benefit is, I've studied a lot of science, and I know how to read papers, and now I'm really learning how. But I wasn't as skeptical back then. There's a couple things they do. They don't let you publish what they don't want out there. That's number one. But the second thing is I never appreciated before is how much of this stuff is simply just made up, or they throw in somebody to muddy the waters. If they think that we're getting close, and an example of that really is people talk today about free energy and why we have, why we're not looking at all this free energy, and all this evidence is coming out about the ether and how we didn't understand the physics. Well, there's a reason for that. And because just in the late 1800s, when we were starting to get that, they threw in a ringer that said, "Oh no," and that's what took us down to Einstein and down the thing. And that ringer was Heaviside. The guy's name was Heaviside. He was a mathematician. Who would think that? But he wasn't a mathematician. They claimed that. They said he rewrote all this mathematics of these electromagnetic equations of Maxwell to get us to make it simpler. When I researched him, now and this is a perfect example. Maxwell was a brilliant engineering kind of. I don't think he had a PhD. I think he was like an electrical engineer, but he was a mathematician essentially. And he developed this whole kind of mathematics that had, instead of vectors being straight, they were curved vectors. It's vector analysis, but it's different than what we study today. So he came up with this whole thing, very thick tome. He wrote lots of things, and those are Maxwell's electromagnetic equations that are used. However, those would have given us the free energy concept, this kind of 0-point energy. However, at least I understand it. Now, I was a math major, and I get some of this, but at some point they lose me when it gets too detailed into the physics. But the point is that they claim that this guy named Heaviside, just kind of wrote it simpler to make it simpler for the average person working with these science issues. Well, but Heaviside had a high school trigonometry level of mathematics.
Are you serious?
Yes, I'm serious. So this is the thing. Nobody goes back and looks to see who they're accepting the truth from. And so Heaviside he was a deaf guy so he couldn't lecture. So they put people in here. This is how they choose their false people. They're usually family members, or they're connected to the people, what I call the system lords, the people running the show. They're connected somehow. For some reason, they never appear in public to really defend their credentials. They have a really unbelievably bad or weird educational history, and they just can't have done what they said they did. I mean, one of mine is Darwin. I've got a bunch of, but Heaviside's interesting because I accidentally stumbled on him looking at something else. But his connection is he's married to the daughter of a famous physics guy that
Oh,
developed
really?
his own bridge. So he was in the family, okay,
Huh.
but he was not. And then they use his name and they kind of use him. He kind of looks good in pictures.
Oh.
That's how they do it.
So
And that's
he's
what
kind of
they're
like
doing now.
he's kind of like the Pied Piper of science, leading everybody down the wrong path because he's very like sexy in that way.
That's exactly a good analogy. So in that moment, they couldn't let us go down this particular direction. Another classic, and so they throw in some guy that's kind of like the juggler. We pay attention to him, and we're not thinking really about who
Yeah.
he was years later. And I wrote in my book, I said, I'm writing this postscript about COVID because I want it to be documented. If I could inscribe this in stone, I would, because that's what's happening. Is over time, things get changed. Here's another example. I've been talking a lot about, because I've looked at all of this documentation and the science that we had at the turn of the 1900s. So at 1900, the predominant theory of cancer was that it was parasites. And I have a ton of research showing before 1930 what they knew about cancer. And they believed it was parasites. They showed how it was parasites. Big names that in academic medicine, that was the prominent belief. Well, one of those big names is Dr. William Russell. He was a pathologist that we studied in medical school in the 70s. He saw what he called the characteristic organism of cancer. And he described parasites, right? He called it but he didn't have a name for it. He wasn't, he said, this is 1890. He said, this is every cancer patient has this organism. It eats the cell from the inside out. We find it here. We find all this stuff. Everything we see in cancer today, he described, and he said, it's in all the cells of all the patients and the interstitial tissue. It's in blood cells and interstitial tissue, every patient. That was echoed by other researchers, the guy that became the chief at McGill University. These are not small names. But what happened is by 1976, we studied William Russell, Dr. Russell, but we didn't get the right term because somebody had changed it in the textbooks over time. It no longer said the characteristic organism, which would have implied an infection. It said, we call these things, Dr. Russell saw these black things in cells of cancer patients. We call them Russell bodies.
No way.
Yes, that is how they do it.
Wow. Yeah. And we saw a lot of vocabulary changes when we were locked down, like the word pandemic, the word vaccine, all of it changed. And so they did it right there with parasites for cancer.
The original misnomer was virus. Virus in Latin doesn't mean a germ, it means poison.
Yeah.
So we just need to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, my profession, which I've honored my life, but as you get older and you start seeing more, you start saying, wait a minute, this is not by accident what's going on with us. So I was already doubting the system before COVID, but
Dr. Merritt, there's so many places I want to go right now with this talk.
Go ahead. I'm talking. I'm just saying we came from a long line of poisoners. I mean, that's the truth. It didn't start with the Rockefellers. It started 5,000 years ago.
Let's close out kind of at a high level on the cancers parasites topic, because I know you and I share a fandom of Dr. Jerry Tennant and his theory of cancer, which it kind of relates to that. But I also want to then explore this idea of what's the difference between a virus and a poison. But I think this topic is so hot right now of whether or not parasites cause cancer. I do just want to stay here for a little longer. So could you talk a little more about that and maybe bring in some Dr. Jerry Tennant stuff and the fact that your body's trying to protect you with the placenta, if that's what you believe?
Well, I haven't really gotten into, I know who Dr. Tennant is and I've read his book, but I haven't really, I've been kind of looking, like I say, I do the historical stuff. You
Yeah.
know, I look at it like my friends who are golfers say, if you hit the golf ball a little bit off on the tee, it's way off on the fairway. This is science. So I
Right.
go back in time to see where did we run our muck here.
Oh, I love that analogy. It's
It
perfect.
just turns out that before 1900, we had three theories of cancer, but the predominant theory was that it was parasites. So in addition to him, and I'm blanking on the guy's name that was from McGill University, became the dean of McGill University Medical School, but he also seconded what Russell had said, and he also showed about how it was actually infectious. That they had, if you know, they had lots of these cases where, and we know that in human beings when they tell you be careful about, don't be putting needles down into cancer, and then you're at risk when you drag the needle out that you're going to spread the cancer. But we never thought of it, even though we think about this for anything else, that that's an infectious issue. There was a guy in I can't remember his name right now, but he was a British researcher in London, and he showed that he was a surgeon at I think it was at famous hospital in London, but he went around to these so-called plague houses, and there were these houses where lots of people seemed to get cancer. Now, keep in mind, this is when cancer was really rare. Like I think it was like 4 in a million, or it was less than 25 in a million people got cancer. It was very, very rare. So, but there were these houses where it showed up all the time. And when he went, so he started investigating these. In this one house, I remember everybody in the house, there were four people who'd gotten cancer. Three of them had died, and one of them was dying. And they all lived in this one house in the same room. So when he goes in the house, he discovers that the room is very damp, whereas the rest of the house isn't. And he discovered that in other houses. And then there was a guy in Luckau, Germany, that looked at this town that had cancer. And of the 5,000 residents, 23% of the town was dying of cancer. That's huge in a time it was only less than 4%
Massive.
wide. Right. It was huge. But when he looked at the town, there were two sides of the town. There was a high dry area and there was a low swampy area. And guess what? 100% of the cancer deaths were in the low swampy area.
Really?
And then in 1909, Harvey Gaylord from Buffalo, New York, he said out loud at a meeting, and it was codified and put in the AMA Journal. That's how I found it. And he said, look, this whole idea of cancer and parasites, we need to stop debating this. We all know parasites cause cancer. The only thing that we need to determine now is it all cancers or some cancers.
Uh-huh.
So there's a ton of more people, but the big ones, there were some Japanese researchers who showed that in animals in the wild that forage for their food, they tend to get parasites in their stomach, and stomach cancer, they call it gon, in Japan, is very prominent. So they've been trying to sort out stomach cancer, and maybe that's what this was about. But coincidentally, this corresponded with the time that the big Japanese bioweaponeer Shiro Ishii was going around looking at labs and thinking about booming up to Japanese bioweapons program. So before World War I, or about that time. So these guys looked at animals in the wild that foraged for their food, that ate a variety of diet, and they found out that most of them had some form of parasites in there. It was a particular shape of spirochetal parasite in their stomach. But if the animal was healthy, it didn't bother them. They seemed to live a normal lifespan, no problems. Then they took it in the lab and they raised rabbits that had never been in the wild. They knew they didn't have parasites in their stomach, and they dosed them with this particular parasite that they found in the wild. Again, if the animal was healthy, nothing happened. But then they did it, they gave the parasite and then they followed it with a vaccine. It turned out it was the vaccine for rabies, but they could have probably picked any of them. They gave it a vaccine. The combination caused the parasite to blow up in the stomach, cause the classic lesions that we would call of squamous cell or adenocarcinoma in the stomach, and kill the animal before its life expectancy.
That research will never see the light of day.
Yes, and that is, and in the 1800s, when smallpox vaccine first started to be used, doctors were screaming at the universities, stop doing this vaccination. It's not saving people, but we're seeing lung problems, particularly tuberculosis. We're seeing heart disease, and we're seeing cancer, sometimes in the very area where you've put the vaccine.
Absolutely.
This was going on before 1900. And the last bit of evidence, which they also covered up, was in 1927, 2027, I believe, was Johannes Fibiger in Copenhagen. And again was a pathologist. You know, the joke about pathologists are they're the guys that autopsy the dead, right? They know everything, but too late. But he knew it
Yeah.
on time. It's just they covered it up. And what he discovered, probably reading the Japanese stuff, he took rats, and in those days, you had to get rat catchers. You had to hire rat catchers to give you the rat specimens. But he had these particular kind of rats, and they bring in 20, 30 rats, and he would experiment on them because he had seen a different type of parasite associated with human stomach cancer. And because that's what he did as a pathologist, he did autopsies. So he saw these things, he dissected it out and said, holy cow, they're right. Here's stomach cancer, and here are these parasites that what we call, what we think of as a mass effect is actually maybe a parasite egg sac. That's what I understand. So what he
Wow.
did was he dosed these rats with this parasite. It was actually later named gongololema carcinoma or something. It was named because it gave it, and he was able to give some rats cancer. Some groups, all of the rats got cancer when he dosed them with this parasite. Other groups, none of the rats got cancer. So now he's saying, wait a minute. I thought I had this figured out. How come I can't produce it in everybody? So he calls in the rat catchers and they say, oh, and he says, what's the difference between these groups? They look identical. They look the same genus of species. Rat catcher says, oh, those ones that got cancer, doc, we caught those in a sugar factory. So let me just review for you what we knew before 1930. We knew the predominant theory of cancer was parasites. We knew that that just the parasite alone wasn't the problem. For those of you of the terrain theory, and you don't want me to say bad things about parasites, that parasites alone were not the thing, but that the parasites, if then the body was somehow damaged with either a high sugar diet or vaccines, then the parasites took you over. And there's an environmental component, and the reason I even looked at this is because during COVID, after the mandated vaccine, not after COVID, but after the rollout of the vaccine for about a year, the military started seeing high rates of cancer in these young guys. People showing up, not like we saw. They're showing up for the first presentation with like stage 4 cancer, stage 3, stage 4 cancer, very advanced cancer, and sent home to die. I said, how pathetic is this? How do we explain this? Do you think cancer in 2021 changed its stripes? No, there's something going on here. And that's when I got going this dive. And it's interesting that I don't remember getting a call from any Air Force person telling me this, but it's in the Marines. It was because the Marines are at Camp Lejeune in places where it's swampy, and it was at the Army place down in Fort Bragg, again, out in the swamps, the marshes, doing, what they do. And I
Interesting.
think that's the way we can explain it is that they probably had a pretty good dose of parasites, but they were young, healthy people. They're
Mhm.
keeping them into their little cysts in their, the immune system's keeping them from bursting out. But then they get something, just the same thing as the Japanese researchers saw in 1918, 1919, when they published, which sounds a lot like a bioweapons program. They found that if you hurt the animal by giving them a vaccine somehow, then the cancer breaks out. Meaning the parasites take you over. So
Wow.
again, and I've heard now there's something in the news the other day. One of my physician friends said, "Oh, you're wrong. Look, they said it's metabolism. It's metabolism and something else." I
Yeah,
said, "Okay, but why is the change? Why does the metabolism change? I mean,
that's right.
why is that happening? And Otto Warburg discovered the metabolism problem in the 1920s. But what he showed was we metabolize our food one way. We have two pathways for most animals, humans, and things. We can do it anaerobically or aerobically. But what he said about cancer cells were they can only do it anaerobically, even in the presence of oxygen. They seem to be what we call facultative anaerobes. They don't like oxygen and they don't use it for metabolism. So they have this one metabolic pathway. But that's also the pathway for parasites.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying there isn't a metabolic component. He was laughed out of. He was a Nobel laureate, very very famous guy. But as soon as he started talking this way, he was laughed out of the auditorium. And he's getting the final word here. Finally, people are looking at they call it the Warburg effect. But why is the Warburg effect? You see, it's not standing alone. I mean, the simplest answer is usually the one that's right in science.
Exactly. Occam's
And the
razor.
simplest answer is when you get parasites, they convert your cells to this metabolism. They are the ones that are metabolizing this way, and you're testing a mix of things. And you can say, why don't we see them? Why aren't we picking this up? Well, if we do the right tests, we are seeing them. So 10 out of 10 MS patients, parasites in the brain, in the spinal cord at autopsy by somebody really looking for them. But if you're not really looking for them, it's not easy always. So in this situation, we're not looking. We don't look at fresh cells anymore. Most of the time, you get everything. It's frozen. It's killed. It's fried over a flame. I mean, we're not looking at fresh blood cells, or we would see them. I've seen parasites in my own bloodstream, and I think I would have been a cancer patient. I had pre-cancer symptoms.
Really? But you're taking antiparasitics and
yeah, because I'm taking antiparasitics, and I can tell you, it stopped the pre-cancer syndromes cold.
Wow. We know so many of our listeners understand the relationship between health freedom and our personal and economic freedoms. It's the same principle. If you're one of our audience who's concerned about inflation, paper asset crises, and ongoing monetary crises, you may have already started accumulating gold and silver or are considering doing so. There's no gold dealer we know who's better positioned to serve the freedom community than Mish International in Menlo Park, California. I'm one of the many happy customers who's purchased gold or silver in their showroom, or I've had it delivered through their secure courier service. They are true veterans who are honest, fair, and reliable, and so knowledgeable regarding all the choices of gold and silver bars and coins to help you choose the products that fit your goals and your worldview. The principal, Robert Mish, is world-renowned for his expertise in rare coins as well. Write down this number, 650-324-9110. That's 650-324-9110. And visit mishinternational.com. That's MISH international.com to learn more about this notable company. Do you ever wonder what my foundation, Free Now Foundation, really does? It turns out that after all the articles and videos that I do, that a lot of people still wonder what we really do. We're California's leading medical freedom nonprofit, but did you know we're the only group in California trying to end the medical mandates so children can go to school safely in California? And what does that mean? People don't get this, but it means there's no need for an exemption if there's no mandate. We won't need a religious exemption. We won't need a medical exemption. We won't need any type of exemptions anymore because parents will just be able to say no. No is a complete sentence. And Free Now Foundation is going to stay in the courts and do this legal strategy, pursue it as long as it takes until parents call the shots again in California and beyond, and parents can just say a simple no. So if you share this vision of a world where we don't have medical mandates, where children do not need an exemption of any sort to go to school, and this work calls to you, please consider supporting us at Free Now Foundation, freenowfoundation.org. That's spelled FREENOW foundation.org, and make a donation today. So Lee, as we think about the introduction of the great white carbs into people's diets and the fact that the military probably eats more great white carbs than any other group because it's a cheap way to feed a lot of people and wheat doesn't tend to spoil. And it's obviously immunosuppressive. That seems like one of the fuels that would be obvious for cancer. And we look at things like Hawaii, where people were basically enslaved to work on sugar plantations, and they all supposedly got sick because of that. But it was not because the white man brought their diseases. The white man brought their sugar and their great white carbs, right?
And that's true. And then that's honestly, I trace that also for smallpox. Smallpox wasn't a virus either. Everywhere and I haven't read this anywhere. I went to the basic data. It doesn't make sense, the story of smallpox. I mean, everybody says, well, you don't believe in vaccines, but you believe in smallpox vaccine, right? And polio vaccine. Well, actually, no, not anymore. I did it one time. But if you look at smallpox, every outbreak is in a time when people were having their diet contracted, their food supply contracted, and it was probably due to war. Every one I can find, it either was during a prolonged war like the 7 Years' War, what was the War of the Roses? There was a 30 Years' War, in Europe. These are when the smallpox broke out. In America, see, stories are told, narratives are written, and it sounds all good. George Washington got smallpox, and so you think it was at Valley Forge, right? But he didn't get smallpox at Valley Forge.
Really?
Just no. He was a young kid, and he was sailing with his brother, who was 19 at the time. So George was somewhat like 14 or less, based on what I could find. And he was going to Barbados from New England, which is probably at least a month or so on a sailing ship, which had, probably not very good provisions. And then in Barbados at the time, just as you were saying, they were so profitable growing sugarcane that they weren't even growing foodstuffs. All the food for the people there, the British colonists, had to come from Britain. So they weren't eating well. He's got a lot of access to sugar. He's been on a ship for a month and a half, this young guy, and he got sick. And so it looks like that smallpox, again, it's when you don't have enough calories, your immune system goes down. Long-term semi-starvation, you turn off things like phase 2 detoxification in your liver, your immune system goes down and you get sick. And when you can't get things out through the liver, most of the time, poisons and toxins, we push them out of the body through our, it's electromagnetic how we push them out of the body. We get them out of the cells. It has to go into the lymph, has to go into the bloodstream, into the liver, where it gets processed for excretion. But if you don't have enough calories, your liver can't process it. So then you're desperate to get these toxins out because you're sick. And at the last gasp, it goes through the skin. So children can have rashes easier, but adults, they don't do that until they're really desperate. And that's where smallpox comes in. When you're really desperate to get rid of these toxins, it goes through your skin. I mean, it's a longer story than that about milkmaids and that whole story. It's all made up. I'm telling you, the whole smallpox is the same thing as COVID, just a little less technical.
It makes total sense to me. And as an adult who is vaccine injured as an adult, I have suffered the most horrible rashes. And they usually come every time I treat aggressively. So even right now, I've been treating myself for a long-term cough and sinus infection. And I have disc-like rashes all over my legs and my arms right now.
I'm not going to show you. Do you use a toxin binder at all?
I do, but I typically forget because I'm so busy.
Yeah, that's me too. But I tell you, there's a time when you're treating yourself actively for something, you probably need that. And I love chlorine dioxide. There's nothing that chlorine dioxide doesn't neutralize, so that helps too.
That's so true. I should go back on that.
That doesn't neutralize fluoride, but.
Oh, okay. But yeah, I know that really well, that when my organs are overwhelmed, then my body's going to use my skin, and it happens again and again. I've also learned that rashes are indicative of things draining down. So if I have a rash on my neck, it's something draining out of my head.
I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that many people looking at this whole parasite and cancer thing also make the point that if you have a clean liver, you don't get the problem. Your liver will clear the tiny little parasites. They never get a toehold. And so once you kill them, they stay killed instead of keeping growing back. So cleaning your liver, I think, is really, however you choose to do it. I mean, I like the homegrown beet juice cleanse, but whatever people do, if you don't have a clean liver, then things are going to get out of control. And I
agree. I've made so much progress since I started liver cleansing about 4 years ago. And I actually go away for once a year to something I like to call poop camp. And I do colon and liver cleansing for 2 weeks at a time. And it's been miraculous.
Well, maybe you ought to try just a little beet cleanse now when you're having these rashes, because I'm telling you, it's so easy to do. And you just need organic beets and you just juice them. I juice them with my mineral drink. They're, a beet that's about that big.
Yeah.
Couple 3 weeks at a time. You can do it 6 weeks. You probably don't want to go over 6 weeks, but you just do it. And then I do it for 6 weeks because in the summer I grow my own beets. And so I've got the beets, time to use them. And then I do it then, and then I freeze some for the winter. But you can't use canned beets. It has to be fresh organic beets. And they have to be juiced, not blended. There's something in the fiber, break up and stuff. So I like that. My herbalist friend told me about that. And I have to say, I can tell you for a fact it works. I've coming off a cruise ship, and what do you do on cruise ships? You do tend to drink a little bit too much. And if you buy the drink package, and so way over what I do at home. And my liver, I mean, I just got to where I wasn't pushing anything out. I felt really constipated, but wasn't really the same. It was something different. As soon as I got home, I just took a beet juice cleanse, and all this stuff came out of my liver. It was really quite impressive.
You got liver stones?
Like little stony things and all
Yeah.
sorts of stuff. It was like granular stuff that's like sediment that came out at first.
Yeah.
And it was back to normal. One day of that, I mean, a couple of days of cleansing, one day of that, and it was over.
Amazing.
I think it works.
Is the color kind of yellow from the liver stones?
Oh, I don't think, I thought it was more gray, but it could, it depends on what you ate and what you did, how you got there.
Okay. Well, I don't want to have the gross out show for people. I could talk about this all day and you probably could too, but
See all sorts of pictures of the parasites in their stools. Don't do that either.
I could look at them all day. So let me go back to, so we talked about sugar. We've talked about the dampness of people who tend to get cancer, but you also talked about the vaccines. And I wanted to bring up something to see if you know more about it than I do. And I'm sure you do. But my understanding of the hepatitis B vaccine is that it's grown in yeast. It's a recombinant vaccine. And the product that's injected into you is 1,000 times more yeast protein than hepatitis B antigen. And so it essentially trains your body, and the people who are going to make antibodies to it, to make antibodies to the yeast. And my understanding from that, this is from Dr. Tetiana Abukanich, who you probably know of. And what she found is that those antibodies that you make to that yeast after you get a hepatitis B vaccine, they cross-react with part of your good biome. So you're constantly killing off your good biome. They cross-react to the yeast that grows naturally on grapes and plums. They cross-react to brewer's yeast, baker's yeast, kombucha yeast also. And so I'm wondering if the vaccine effect for the parasites has to do with this constant killing off of your own biome in certain cases if you're making antibodies to your own biome. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, it makes sense. Just to simplify this, though, I think the way we should look at this is that if there's no organism, in fact, this is the one that should have been made the lie right away. And where was academic medicine and all this? Okay, recently, this whole issue of smallpox. Smallpox is based on the idea that it was a virus. Okay, that's number one. This unseeable, unprovable creature, this virus of smallpox, but that it was killing people, but the milkmaids were not dying. They had beautiful unscarred faces because people get scars from this pox on their skin. And this brilliant Dr. Edward Jenner happened to discover this and see these milkmaids and think, oh, there must be a disease called cowpox that gives them some immunity so they're not dying of smallpox. So literally the first smallpox vaccine was cow udder pus that he took, and they didn't have needles back then, but they would just take blades, surgical blades type thing, and they would scarify the skin. I mean, they'd make little slits in the skin, and then they would rub cow pus from the udder of these heifers in. But somebody should have taken a look at the fact in modern medicine, is there cowpox? Because the answer is there is not. And the reason I say that is for a couple of reasons. One is that baby heifers don't get it, bulls don't get it, steers don't get it. Only the heifers that are being milked by the dirty hands of the milkmaids were getting cowpox, okay? And so I said, wonder if the veterinarians know this. And I looked it up, and yes, they do. They don't call it cowpox. They call it pseudo-cowpox, meaning it's not really cowpox. They call it milkmaids' nodules. They know, modern veterinarian science knows that the milkmaids were giving the nodules to the cows. And it's still, even though we don't have milkmaids like we did, it's still an issue of using automated milking machines. It can, so it could be bacteria, it could just be toxic stuff. The milkmaids could have had syphilis. We don't know what it was. Right. But the point being that was an excuse, and Edward Jenner was a fraud, and he was paid an equivalent of $2 million by the government to run this program. They had the kings and queens and the royalty come out and give testimonials how everybody should get vaccinated for this terrible disease. We'll stop this from happening again. You're not a good person if you don't come out and get smallpox. You see, it's the same program that we did in COVID. It's just different. But my point is that if you don't have virus, then hepatitis B vaccine, any of these vaccines, what are they making it to? I mean, it's just toxic stuff, and it may vary from vaccine to vaccine. We don't know, and they don't have to tell us. People should realize the labeling laws are changed, and they don't really have to tell us what's in vaccines for the most part. They can replace 50% of what's in a vaccine from year to year and not go through approval again and not label it completely. So
That's
this is
insane.
where we are. And I will just say that these vaccines are damaging us in some way that is the same damage. It's not mRNA. It's not some special pseudo super science now, because the same three things that are happening under COVID happened under smallpox, which was clearly not the technology we have today. It's just the poison of the year, I think, that goes into these things. But whatever it is, it can't be a virus. I asked my friend Judy Mikovits, I said, I've heard you talk, Judy. I hate to say this as an orthopedic surgeon and you're a viral researcher, but you got to stop using that term virus, because you don't describe a virus. In other words, she uses that term virus, and so many people do, but they don't talk about it flying through the air and being airborne to make other people sick. And that is the key point. So she said, yeah, no, it's not that. It's infection by injection.
Mm.
And there's where we get to what you mentioned about Plum Island and all this bioweapons research. It's always been about taking out something from one species of animal or other humans and injecting it into us. They've had to get it under our skin. It's not airborne. They can't aerosolize it and kill us. They've tried all these things. And I say they, you can argue who they are, but it does appear to be a program. It's one thing after another thrown at us, but that doesn't seem to depopulate us enough. And they have written specifically that that's part of what this is about. That so they've got to get it under the skin. If don't, it's it has to be injectable. So it's not. Michael Yeadon, the former vice president of Pfizer, recently came out this last year, and he said, and he was a pulmonary researcher for Pfizer, chief science officer in Britain. He said there's no evidence of airborne transmission of disease. So that's a pretty good shocker. I mean, I didn't really think there was, but maybe TB, I thought, but no, not even tuberculosis. It's all by probably tactile toxins like we get, or food poisons,
Okay.
parasites in the food, bacteria in the food.
So in other words, contact toxins, right?
You pick up in the environment. And again, I want to speak to the terrain people. I'm not saying that bacteria are somehow evil causing disease, but the problem is if I poison your immune system, then you're not able to respond normally to what's going on. And even if the bacteria is there to clean up the mess, it now becomes the problem.
Right.
And that's what we see sometimes in bacterial pneumonia. We also see there's a lot of stuff we're learning, though, that what we think is one disease is not what we've been told. We've got to relearn our thinking about medicine and now the issue of electromagnetics and lots of things causing us to be diseased. But it's not air. One thing we need to rule out, and will change our life, and it will get us out of this mess, is thinking that we get sick from our neighbor. This is what it's all about. If we think we get sick from an airborne little germ, we're going to look askance at our neighbor. If we think we're being poisoned, finally, after thousands of years, we'll start looking for the poisoners.
Right. And then we can band together against the poisoners instead of calling out our neighbors and our friends for not being compliant.
Yeah, and not wearing a mask. Yeah.
So for the people who really don't yet understand the difference between a contact toxin and a virus, one of the things that helps me understand the difference is the fact that a virus doesn't have any respiration and it doesn't have any digestion. So it's not going to seek out anything to get those things. So what is the difference between a virus and a contact toxin?
Well, for what they call a virus is simply a very small amount of genetic material wrapped in a little lipid membrane that somehow gets into you and gets into the nucleus of the cell, takes over the machinery, and uses your genetic machinery to reproduce itself and then create havoc. That's the story. Okay. In retrospect, it falls apart on many reasons that can happen. But the point is that the people say, well, how can there not be viruses? I can see them on an electron microscope. Well, but there are these other things called exosomes, and these are little pieces of genetic material, again, just like the virus, little piece of genetic material wrapped in a lipid membrane that come out of the cell. And when you look at and I used to work in an EM lab, so I'm telling you this is true. When you look at these beautiful pictures, they're colorized, okay? They're colorized, they use a lot of CGI. When you really see the pictures of what they call a virus, it just looks like a little round blob, and it is essentially, except by their definition, indistinguishable, in my opinion, from exosomes. If I took it to scientists involved in this particular area of science, they might say, well, if give me the number of nanometers give me how big that is, and I'll tell you what it is. Well, but if I took it to a 10th grader or a 5th grader and I showed them all these blobs and I said, do you see the difference in these? They would say no. I mean, it just looks like a blob on your windshield. It's just a little round dot with a little thing around it. Some of them are bigger and other. It's just so.
You can't ascribe any qualities to a brown
No
dot. It's
qualities
not
to
going to
it.
seek out a cell.
It's not alive by our definition of anything else being alive. However, the question is, can we be poisoned with a little bit of genetic material? I think so. But it's not from our own bodies coming out. It's from somebody making it and injecting it into us. I don't think that's why I think they've had to have this vaccine paradigm, this whole narrative, because they can't, the idea that they're going to spray the city with viruses just doesn't work. Now they could spray it with poisons, and we saw this. If you really look at polio was clearly a poison. It was first it was arsenic, and the first animals to get it were horses, because they would eat the apples that they were using arsenic on in the Pacific Northwest for insecticides, right? FDR, one of the most famous polio victims. Why did he get polio? Because he loved blueberry pie. And in the summer, he would go to Campobello, and that was the biggest blueberry farm around there. And they were using some kind of insecticide. It may not have been arsenic at that time, but it may have been one of the new organophosphates that had just come out as a result of the nerve gas in World War I. And they were using that as an insecticide. And he ate the pie every night, and he got polio. Now, one of his other sons, I think, got a little dose, but the kids that didn't eat the pie didn't get it. So they're not breathing on each other, making people have polio. It was his habit.
Wow.
And honestly,
I've never heard that
there's so
before.
much evidence about that. It's just that modern physicians are not taught this in medical school.
No, they're not. I'd never heard the blueberry pie story.
Yeah, we aren't talking about this. So so if you ask me what I think COVID was, it's just an upgraded variant of this. Now, when I say it has to get in under your skin, it doesn't have to be injected if it's a very sophisticated lipid soluble toxin. In other words, it can go through your skin. That's a little hard, though, to spread in a mass way, but it can be done. And like, for example, DMSO, if I put an insecticide in my hand and then I put DMSO on it, I've just pushed it into my bloodstream. So it's possible, but it's a little harder. That's why it's easier to just have us line up like good little robots and go get our injections. Flu shot. They got us in the habit of doing that, not me, but they got people in the habit of doing this flu shots every year. And so when it was COVID, it was just another shot. People are not thinking about this. I wouldn't buy toothpaste from these psychopaths, let alone take another vaccine from them for anything, whether it's shingles, pneumonia, I don't care. And certainly not hepatitis, because what is hepatitis? Again, hepatitis, we know about chemical hepatitis.
Right.
We know how the liver functions, and the liver can recover if we give it a chance. We don't quit poisoning, if we quit poisoning it. So there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of ways you can get to chronic hepatitis without invoking any kind of virus.
Right, because if you just look at the origin of the word, hepa is liver and itis is inflammation. So it's inflammation of the liver. That doesn't say there's a cause.
That's right. And keep in mind that just because, polio came around polio is a good example. Polio came around in the cities because they were spraying for insects in the summers. My friend in New York City, he and his mother would go up to the Poconos. That was a famous thing. The Jewish community, the mothers would go up and play. It's a dice thing up in the Poconos every summer to get out of there because they were afraid of getting polio. But it was really the poisons being spread, and the kids would run their bicycles through the fumes, right?
Oh yeah.
And so when they have stopped doing the daytime spraying, but now they come around, even in my little town in the Midwest, and they spray at 2:00 in the morning. They spray at night when we don't know. And what's going on now? Well, we have dementia. You know, all just keep in mind, all insecticides are neurotoxins. So when you talk about neurologic disease, we're spraying a neurotoxin all over the place all the time. We're eating it on our foods. We've got it all over the place. So we are under a mass poisoning, and that is unfortunately the truth. And when they covered up by telling us about all these infectious diseases and making us afraid, so we're not thinking straight. We stay in our house, we stand in a circle, and we do all these stupid things.
What do you say to the people who are real skeptics and say, well, I got chicken pox. Somebody with chicken pox was in my room and I hadn't had it yet and I got chicken pox. And what do you say to those people?
Actually, that's a really interesting one. Okay, that
Okay.
one, and also um, uh, Marburg are probably the same kind of thing. So there's another way to get sick that we haven't talked about. Again, there's lots of ways to get. I mean, it's about electron stealing. It's about energetics. We are electromagnetic holograms. And so ultimately, this is all electromagnetic at some level. We should have been studying more physics and less biology. But the Russians have been on all over this for a long time. So in the 20s and 30s, there were these two scientists, Gurevich and Kaznachev, and they were looking at how this would explain the chickenpox. They were kind of looking at how cells behave. I don't even remember how they started on this, but what they did is, let's say I took a bunch of muscle from somebody, just a muscle biopsy, and I cut it in half, and I put one half in one petri dish and the other half in the other petri dish, and I put a lid on so they don't have any airflow going to each other, so they're not sharing air, but they could see each other through an optical window. So there's a window between them, and I can put either glass or I can put quartz. And then on, let's say, side A, I poisoned side A with something. Maybe I give it arsenic, or maybe I give it a bacterial toxin, or maybe I irradiate it. But whatever I do to side A, they're very close together, but they're not sharing air. So it can't be an airborne virus, right? It can't be. So I poison side A, and then I see what happens to side B. And the story is, and this is well worked out now, if there's window glass between them, nothing happens to side B. It goes its merry way. If it's quartz between them, something in the electromagnetic frequency range, like ultraviolet, flows into side B and makes it sick with the same symptoms as you poison side A. So if I use arsenic on side A, quartz in the middle, side B will get arsenic poisoning. If I put radiation on side A, side B, without being irradiated, will get radiation poisoning. So what's happening? The Russians called these photoni smerti, the death photons. And they said, what's the difference between quartz and window glass? Quartz is ultraviolet. It allows ultraviolet through. So they thought there were electromagnetic emanations from dying tissue or sick tissue that go out into the atmosphere, but they don't go necessarily very far, but they don't go through window glass. They will go through quartz. Now, chickenpox, why do we need chickenpox parties? If chickenpox is this great infectious disease that all these kids get, why does it happen that they have to be not just in the same community, but in the same room? You just said, this kid came in my room and I got chickenpox. Because if they're outside the window, this can't happen.
Right.
I can't prove chickenpox, but I have a feeling this is something like that. Larry Palevsky told me one time, and he's a pediatrician that hasn't used vaccines for 20 years now. So he said it was not because of something that is passing at a distance. It's got to be close up. And I've lost my train of thought on what he was going to say about this, but he'd been looking to, because I know what it was. He says, I think at some point, you're 3, 4 years old when people get chicken pox often, that your body just has been crawling. You've been crawling on floors. You've been eating putting all sorts of stuff in your mouth, and you probably got a good toxin load in your body every once in a while. As a child says, I'm just going to detox. It's a good time to detox. And in children, unlike adults, your skin is very porous, so it's an easy way for them to detox. You just push it out through the skin and get a rash.
Really?
And my only added to it is the idea that you can transfer that signal to other people, because what are our bodies? We signal each other in the body. That's what the whole study of biophotonics is. The
Hmm.
idea that our cells signal in the UV range, they think, through biophotonic energies. Well, if you're close enough to somebody, and their cells, Joe's cells are saying, "Oh, we're detoxing. We're going to detox, and we're going to push this stuff out through our skin." It sends some signal to Nancy, and she starts detoxing. And says it could be that. It could be that.
Right.
We do have evidence in humans that Koznachev-Gurevich effect is true. We have, if you're close enough, if you put human to human close enough of dying tissue, that was done in a Canadian study, it will transfer that death photon to somebody else. So,
Wow.
so it can happen. So I think that's probably what chickenpox is.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Wait. So you just said that children's skin is more porous than adult skin.
Right. So it's softer. Think about how baby skin, how beautiful it is. So it's not, there's no resistance to getting a rash because you can just push your toxins out. For me, my skin is older, more leathery and drier. And that's not where I don't get rid of, by the time I have a rash, I'm on death's door because I'd rather push my body says, oh no, we'll just take it out through the liver, much easier, much less energy than putting it out through the skin.
Right.
Or peeing it out, coughing it out, bleeding it out, sweating it out. We sweat it out.
Right. Yeah. And babies don't tend to sweat.
Yeah, they don't do that.
No. I studied the vibrational qualities of stones. Yeah. And quartz is actually known to be conductive.
This is magic stuff.
Yeah, it really is. So if you have quartz in between two enclosed containers, there is going to be a signal that can go through in either direction.
Yeah, I know. I think that's true. And another point is that Royal Rife had these beautiful microscopes and all that complicated stuff that people see in the pictures. That doesn't matter. That was all for taking pictures. He was tasked with making a nice copy book for parasites, right? A nice thing for doctors, actually. Big, nice color pictures of parasites. And so he realized that the standard microscopes weren't good enough for good photographs. So that's why he built these. But the reason he could see colors and bacteria changing and figure out what wavelength was what he called the mortal oscillatory resonance, the thing that could shake them and interrupt their cell structure and kill them. Because he used quartz optics in his microscope from the level of the slide all the way through his eye optic. It was all quartz channel. We don't do that. Now you have to ask yourself, why not?
Right.
That wouldn't be that expensive to have quartz cut lenses, a few up the column, but once in a while somebody gets a nice microscope, you might get a quartz eyepiece, but if it isn't quartz lenses down below, you're filtering out the UV.
How fascinating.
So
wow.
That's why his microscope was 15,500. This was in 1920s. Our average microscope in a lab is 2,400. It could go up to 4,000, 5,000, but it's not that strong compared to his. Now, have you ever seen the show Silo? They tell us in TV and movies what's going on. There's a Silo. Okay, well, it's about a survivalist kind of situation where people don't even know what the apocalypse or what happened, but the thing that killed off most of the world. But they're in these underground bunkers that look like big silos, big round things. And there's only two, and they've been there for generations now. And they've got, sheriff, they've got police, they've got a whole town government structure and everything, 10,000 people in one of these. And so it turns out there are only two laws that will get you chucked out to sudden certain death, they're assuming, out of the silo. And one of them has to do with transportation. And one of them is magnification over a certain amount.
Seriously?
I watched that show and I said to my husband, stop it right there. And let's put on subtitles. I have to go up and get a photograph of the screen, But they're telling us. So it was a capital offense and the doctor is the one that says this. They come up from engineering and they want him to use his abilities to magnify things, to look at some piece of an old motherboard or something. I don't know what it was they wanted to magnify. And he said, I can't do that because if I go over a certain amount, I could be murdered. I could be killed for that capital punishment.
Unbelievable. They do always tell us, don't they?
So we're blind. This is like being the blind doctor. So you're blinded from seeing what they don't want you to see. They also tried to make dark field microscopy illegal because that would have shown us the parasites.
Oh, that's been totally disparaged, but it is so accurate.
And why did they make such a big deal about ivermectin? Really? It had been used in medicine for a long time. Why did they make such a big deal about hydroxychloroquine? Literally, as a physician, if I wanted to treat somebody, and I had this experience, if you called in hydroxychloroquine for COVID, you're only calling in like 24 pills, usually something like that. And they would deny it because they'd say, "Are you treating COVID?" If you say yes, then they would deny it at some of these pharmacies.
Right.
But if I hung up the phone, took off that hat and put back on my orthopedic hat, and I called it in for rheumatoid arthritis, and I called in 180 capsules with unlimited refills, no problem, because they knew I was treating rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or something like that.
Right, right. Well, and they had to do that to get the EUA for the COVID shots because you couldn't have any adequate available alternatives.
They didn't want us to know the magic of antiparasitic drugs and what it would do to change the whole equation here. I think
Right.
that's really it.
And have you seen that study? Nicholas Hulscher is one of the authors where it shows 84% success rate for cancers, where it's either stabilized, reversed, or cured. God forbid you use the word cured with cancer, right? But it's miraculous.
Yeah, we hear people all the time that they did fenbendazole like the Tippin protocol when they also got conventional treatment, but they were the only one in their treatment cancer group that survived. And
Wow.
they didn't want to tell their doctor because they didn't want to get thrown out of conventional therapy. They were afraid to stop the conventional therapy, but they wanted to do everything they could. So they learned about this. They added the fenbendazole. They survived. The people that just did conventional therapy, I hear that story all the time.
Me too.
My point is to people, don't wait until you have cancer. You know, it'd be lovely to have perfect knowledge. I'd love to have the whole knowledge, but there's so much evidence now. In fact, parasitologists know this. They know. Dr. Omar Amin has a lab and he does studies. He's shown that he's got like a list of 120 specific cancers and what parasite causes them.
Really? I didn't know we were down to that level of
Yeah, so does
specificity.
the veterinarians. They do that. They have 200 different veterinarians know this. They have 200 different tumors for animals, different animals, and they have all the different parasites associated with it. So they know this.
Wow. So do you think all cancer is caused by parasites?
I think all cancer is caused by parasites.
What
I
about
absolutely do. That
Okay.
was the debate in 1909, but I don't think we should be debating it anymore.
Yeah, really.
I
What
think we
about
should be
blood
studying
cancers?
it and optimizing this. The problem is that those of us that believe this and have looked at the old literature, because they've been hiding this for a long time, we've looked at the literature, we've looked at the numbers. This is the best explanation. You don't have to have a cockamamie explanation of very intricate, highly expensive research to look into certain aspects of this when you've got this really simple answer sitting here. You should just be studying it. It's hard. That's the one thing that the government and big institutions can do better than the average family doctor is not necessarily think, we found out, but at least they can fund very good studies that we can do long term, and we can, as long as the problem with the funding is the funding funds you to get the answer they want. And if they don't want you to know this, you're still not going to win, but it might be helpful. Might be helpful to get we need some private donors to set up to help us do some studies on the outside. That would be great.
We sure do. Lee, what about blood cancers? Are those caused by parasites also?
Well, I think so. I can tell you that we had a patient or somebody on my podcast who didn't take the vaccines but couldn't stop her husband. He took 2 of the vaccines. He got leukemia. She did the protocol, and at that time it was just really for vaccine. I had it on there for vaccine remorse. I wasn't thinking about cancer, but she did that protocol that had ivermectin on it and after a couple months of ivermectin, he went back to his cancer doctor and he had no leukemia and they couldn't explain it.
Wow.
You know, we've seen that a lot. So we hear the stories, we know about so many people, and then, you know, just it's not just that this idea that you just cleanse your liver and they get rid of the parasites also works. Ed Group had somebody that was dying of pancreatic cancer, which is a bad one. We don't have a great treatment for that. And he was given 2 weeks to live. He went to Ed, who runs a lab, makes all these nice products. And Ed said, "Well, I don't know what to do, but you could try doing a liver cleanse." So the guy buys a couple of his 1-day liver cleanses. He's still alive. So then he gets some 2-day liver cleanses. He's still alive. Gets some week liver cleanses. This goes on and on until about 3 or 4 months. I think Ed told me 3 or 4 months later, after he's done all these liver cleanses, he kept doing liver cleanse after liver cleanse. And after about 3 or 4 months, he goes back to his doctor. They can't find any cancer in him.
That's
He didn't do
incredible.
he didn't do ivermectin. He didn't do anything. He just cleansed his liver. And I've heard that story also about liver transplant. People that were on the liver with the beet juice cleanse, they were on the liver transplant list. They just did they did this really serious 6 week course. They waited a while. They did it again. They went back 3 or 4 months later, and the new doctor hadn't seen him. Said, "Why are you there?" And he said, "Well, I'm one of your liver transplant people." Says, "I don't know why your liver enzymes are normal." So
That's
the
incredible.
punchline here is that the body has an immense amount of healing capacity if we just don't keep poisoning it.
Right. We have to get out of the way. You just have to get out of the way. And by the way, I love the idea of the treatment being the diagnostic. If the antiparasitic protocol works or the liver cleansing works, then you know what caused it because you just reversed it.
At least it doesn't really matter what caused it.
Right.
You need to really do $30 million worth of studies to prove some little chemical trivia thing when we know that treating the parasites treats the problem.
Yep.
For me, I'm a practical person. In ortho, we break bone, fix bone. We don't overthink this. And I don't think this is just because they like to overthink this. I think this is the historical point that back since the 20s, the Nazis hid Kurt Blom, who was the head of the bioweapons program, provably for the Wehrmacht and the SS. It's all on paper. Where was he? He was at the Cancer Institute. What did we do with our bioweapons program after we signed the bioweapons treaty? We turned it over to the NIH for the Cancer Institute, for the NCI. So and now the Army is fighting a war on cancer. And again, why is the Army fighting a war on cancer? Why do I use my tax dollars for that? Well, we have a constitutional, point that you're supposed to fund our defense, so it's never going to be defunded like you would defund private things. And the second thing is, we give military a lot of passes to do the dark programs, and so it can go into a black hole, and we don't know what they're doing with that money. And one of the reasons I suspect that, and I'm not suicidal, by the way, one of the reasons I suspect that is the program is called Applied Proteogenomics and Organizational Learning Outcomes, which is a crazy name. I said, what the hell does that mean? And it turns out, I was in the Navy for over 10 years. It's an acronym, Applied Proteogenomics. The acronym is Apollo. And Apollo, let me tell you, when we take the Hippocratic Oath, we take it to Apollo. Apollo was not we call it Apollo the physician. It was actually not. He was Apollo the poisoner. They call him Apollo the physician even in ancient times. But he was only known for two things: bringing plagues and bringing poisons. He shows up in the Iliad that way. He shows up. And if you think it's all a myth, I mean, these temples to Apollo existed all over the ancient world, specifically in the area of Phrygia and Anatolia. That's where his headquarters was. And in fact, Hippocrates was his grandfather or some close relative of him was an hereditary priest of Apollo, who himself was a poisoner. So
really,
yes, physicians come from a long line of poisoning. And what we were told in medical school was not true, that Asclepius was the god of medicine. Well, it turns out he's a demigod. He's the son of Apollo. And if you really look at this history, all the names like coronavirus, it comes from the woman that Coronis. Coronis is all over. You look for Coronis and you'll find Coronis Optical, Coronis Medical, Coronis Hospital, Apollo Hospitals, Apollyon. Apollyon in Greek means the god of the pit, the demonic god of the pit, but there's Apollyon Hospital in Greece. I mean, it's all over. The Apollo cancer centers are all over India. So Apollo is a poisoner, and that's when we take the Hippocratic Oath. This only applies to MDs, not DOs or chiropractors or anybody else. So they didn't get captured like we did, but we got captured, and I think this explains a lot, to be honest. I was naive. I didn't think about this. I didn't see this part of the world. I never grew up in a world where I thought we were being ruled by demonic entities. I mean, I had no clue. I mean, really, most people don't. But when you go to medical school, you've already graduated, you've got the diploma in your hand, essentially. But now you all stay in your seats, and then in your program is the Hippocratic Oath. And we all stand up, and in unison, dare I say, a chant, we recite the Hippocratic Oath. And this is what it says: I swear by Apollo the physician and Asclepius and Panacea and Hygeia with all the gods and goddesses as my witness. So you raise your hand and you swear an oath. And that oath is to the poisoner in chief, Apollo. Now, knowing what I do now, I sat at my desk when I figured this out. And for my book, I was thinking about this. I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did this. And I repented and I just said, listen, I sever all ties with that cult. I do not want any part of this. And I am very, very sorry I ever took that oath, because you don't need to. But see, they never tell you that. You're there with your family and friends, and you think it's kind of like it's kind of cutesy history and kind of just a brotherhood kind of thing. No, you took an oath. I mean, I don't think you take an oath to be a train driver, for example, an engineer. But you take an oath to be a doctor. You take an oath to be a judge. You take an oath to be, in a political office and things. Then all those others matter. Why would we think the oath to Apollo didn't matter?
Right. And what a bizarre oath. I had no idea who you were making the oath to. That's bizarre.
Now, the rest of it's pretty good. I mean, I don't disagree with the rest of it. But to get there, you have to know the history and the fact that that's who we now. Just as a side note, Asclepius, they also hide the real bad guys, because you don't really. How many people would think this is a little odd to have all these symbols of murderous people all over medicine? But we do. It's not just that. We've got the symbol of the caduceus is a symbol of the death bird. That's the wings of the caduceus is the cockatrix bird that could kill you by looking at you. The darting eye of the cockatrix, Shakespeare talking about. Why do we have all these death symbols as a symbol of medicine? So we should have questioned this, but we would have understood if we understood the symbolism of medicine. We wouldn't have gotten so trapped in COVID, because Asclepius was the demigod son of Apollo. And the way it happens is Apollo gets this woman pregnant, and then she escapes him at the last minute, just before the baby's due to be born. He hunts her down, kills her, does the first C-section, and out pops Asclepius, who's now a demigod of medicine. But who's the woman? Who is mom? Mom's name is Coronis. So we don't have coronavirus because it looks like any kind of crown under the electron microscope. That's the story. No, we call it coronavirus because it is an homage to an ancient pagan religion. And that religion has been poisoning us since 5000 BC.
Unbelievable.
It's a cult of poisoners, and that really is, and they admit this. I mean, there was a cult of poisoners, and that's how they conducted war. That's how they conducted politics. That's how we've got corporations. To be honest, corporations came about because the elites of these ancient empires, didn't trust their own government to protect them, and they hired private military contractors. Think the Wagner Group, or what's the one we have in Eric Prince's group. So these private military contractors, and they needed a private corporation structure to pay them, so they were not being paid by the government and they could trust them, And it was to prevent them from getting poisoned. Alexander the Great was poisoned, and he was a poisoner. Wow. I mean, it's all about poisoning. So we need to wake the hell up and realize this is a systematic poisoning. And people say, well, who's doing it and why? Well, it's the elites. It's not us. We don't want, do you want to poison anybody? Do you want to kill off half the world with poisons? I don't. And I think that we have to realize it's not the average human being that's doing this. Right. And when you look at why they're doing it, go no further than reading Plato, which is considered, if you read Wikipedia's little blurb about Plato's Republic, it says it's the finest work of political philosophy of its, ever throughout history. Great thing. But what does it actually say? In book 5, it's about marriage. Plato, as in this form of Socrates, is saying, he's talking to his student, and he's saying, in the future, medical doctors will need to be made of sterner stuff. And his student says, well, why is that? And then Socrates says, well, because to keep the state from getting too big or too small, doctors, anybody can give a diet, but the doctors of the future will need to use medicines to help keep the state the right size. In other words, they're talking about, this is 2000 BC, they're talking about, or 400 BC, they're talking about population control.
Right. Yeah, they're not talking about medicines for fertility. They're talking about population reduction and poisoning. Absolutely. Wow.
Have you ever seen the show Stargate? It's a
No.
10-year, oh, okay. It's telling us the whole story.
Really? Okay. Writing it down.
I was in residence, or I was in private practice when this all came out. It was 2004 to 2014. And it's about time travel, not time travel. It's about these big round Stargate things that we see pictures of, by the way, in Iraq and other places in the Middle East around, and that you travel to different worlds by just stepping through this Stargate. That's the premise, and it's about the Air Force runs it, Cheyenne Mountain, and everything. But every one, I'm taking a book of notes. Every one of these. Well, but some of this stuff is about. So one of them is about how they make an alliance with these foreign entities who look like us, talk like us, and walk like us, but they're not us. Again, that's one of the themes that go through here, that there are people that don't like us, but they come to us as friends, and they look identical, and we can't tell them apart easily. And they come and they give us their advanced medicine. And one of them was a vaccine for anti-aging.
Oh, really?
And one of the people who takes the vaccine now can't have, she's a female, she can't have children. She finds out her ovaries are not there anymore. They've shriveled down. And then she gets into, because she's doing research for them, she gets into their computer and finds out that they've got the numbers, that they've now decreased fertility in the world by 90%.
Wow.
I saw that. Again, I'm writing this down so I don't forget, but I saw that and I said, that's really what this is going towards.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's about population reduction.
Yeah, what we call eugenics was genetics, or genetics was eugenics, was population control.
Yeah. I call it a weaponized architecture, to make us choose these things. And a weaponized architecture in the physical form, one example is a mousetrap. And it doesn't matter who set the mousetrap. It's just the mouse is tempted and it goes in and then snap, it's dead.
Right.
And they're setting up these weaponized architectures for us again and again and again. And you have to recognize them. And once you recognize one, you can start recognizing all the other forms of it. But they just keep changing it a little and people think it's something novel. And now we're back to hantavirus. And we can end here where, this is just like another iteration of the COVID narrative and people are falling for it. And now we need to know how many rats apart we need to stand. But it's basically the COVID narrative all over again, except they're trying to do it with something that seems more deadly to people, right?
Right. And Warburg's it's a similar but different scam. Warburg actually came out of the Kosnachev lab. It's an electromagnetic hit. I've looked at every case of Warburg in the world that I could find, and it only really affected the people in the Warburg lab and two sets of miners in Africa, like gold miners and diamond miners or whatever. So it's an asset acquisition thing, but they were just murdered using this technology. I don't know how it actually works, but it's not a virus either. But yeah, I mean, you cannot look at this and not see a systematic approach to mass murder. I mean, again, and part of it is it's the depression and the despair that happens. And I just have to say, I'm feeling hopeful. I think when you start seeing the matrix crumbles, when you start questioning and seeing anything that's true, when you start recognizing the falsehoods, the thing starts crumbling until one day it's just not there. And we're getting close to that. It doesn't take 100% of people. It takes just enough to collapse this matrix. And I think we're going to, because the other thing I looked at was, they used to always push how many people committed suicide every year. Remember that? I mean, civilians, and they always did it, and about medical doctors, how many of us did it every year? And it was a lot. We're not, dentists are number one by profession. I think we're number two. But in any case, we lost to medical school a year, they used to say. Suddenly, all those numbers are dried up. But I did just look them up a little bit from other sources, and I discovered that generally, that in the United States, our suicide rate started going up. Really, it started 10 years before COVID, but it really kicked up in 2022. And then 2024 was the highest rate of suicide since World War II, since 1941.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, apparently we had a tick up in World War II, which is understandable.
Yeah, it is. Well, and dentists used to get exposed to so much mercury that has a terrible effect on the nervous system and can cause anxiety disorders. And then you think back to the Seinfeld episodes that made fun of how weird dentists are. But I always thought that's because they were exposed to so much mercury.
Maybe they were telling us something.
Yeah,
Now when you go
maybe.
back and you see these old shows, you say, "Oh my gosh, that's what they were telling us. I didn't get it then."
Exactly. No, we don't. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lee Merritt, for helping us get it now. I think we're all overdue for being able to get it and see it as it is. And you've helped me and so many other people see things as they really are. And I cannot thank you enough for your research and your beautiful ability to communicate everything you've learned with us. Tell us about your new book. It's called Escaping the Medical Matrix. When is it going to be out and where can we get it?
Well, it's going to be out in August. It should be on Amazon. I'm having an Escaping the Medical Matrix conference in Omaha, Nebraska on August 21st. So it's got to be out before then. So I'll do some book signing there. And we also and the whole idea, the point is that once you get out of the matrix, once you see it for what it is and you don't want to be a part of it, how do you move forward? How do we move forward? Because so many, you hear it all the time, people don't want to go back to the hospital. Even though they know they're sick, but they know what they did, and they don't trust them anymore. So we have to work through now the actual practical details of where we go from here, and that's one of the reasons to get people together. It's not just about people talking. We'll have some really great speakers, but it's also about time with like-minded people that can talk about these kinds of issues and think. It's a think tank. How do we move on? How do we implement these things? How do we implement light therapy? And what should we be really thinking about with parasites? So that's what we're going to be doing.
That is going to be a fascinating conference. I encourage everybody who can get there to get there. I'm going to do my best to get there. I've got a lot of trips this year. Yeah, it'll be very, very fun. And I'm from the Midwest, so it'd be really nice to go back to the Midwest for something like this and get to see you in person again.
Yeah, nice. And they can find to join. I put some things out, but they can find it at themedicalrebel.com and just go to courses and you'll see it listed there.
Okay, that's
We're going to have
fantastic.
an online one too. So
You're so great. Dr. Lee Merritt, thank you so very much for sharing everything with us. You are a font of knowledge, and I just appreciate you so much.
Thank you. It's been great meeting you.
We are so happy to have as our prime sponsor, Mish International, Northern California's acclaimed specialists in rare coins and gold and silver investments. Our friend and supporter, Robert Mish, is the same principal that started the company back in 1963, and he's still there every day with 63 years of experience. He has integrity, reliability, and fair pricing, whether you're buying or selling. When you have business to do with precious metals, you'll always be treated well at Mish International. Call 650-324-9110 and tell Robert that Alix sent you.